Today, my guest is author Chris Cleave. We will be talking about his new novel, now in paperback, from Simon & Schuster, Little Bee. Chris is a columnist for the Guardian newspaper in London. When the hardcover of Little Bee came out, it was shortlisted for the UK's Costa Best Book Award in 2008, and in 2009 for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize for Best Book. It's a London, Sunday Times, and New York Times bestseller. His first novel, Incendiary, was published in 20 countries, won the 2006 Somerset Maugham Award, was a candidate for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, won the U.S. Book of the Month Club's first fiction award, and won the Prix Spécial du Jury at the French Prix des Lecteurs 2007. That's not bad for a young author. Chris Cleave lives in London now with his wife and 2 children, but we are so lucky that he's on tour in the U.S. and we get to interview him. Hi, Chris. Welcome to the show.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me on. Your introduction made me sound a lot smarter than I am.
Oh, well, now, we're not going to be shy about that. You deserve everything that you've received, believe me. Well, let's start talking about your book, Little Bee. Little Bee is a very unusual story, and I'd like you to give my audience a brief overview of the story.
Sure. So Little Bee is the name of a Nigerian refugee. She's a girl of about 14 years old when the story begins. She's smart, she's wise, and she's funny, and she's really resilient and resourceful. But she's fleeing from something that's terrifying that's happened in her past. And she flees from Nigeria to the West, and specifically to London, which is the city I live in, seeking refuge. So she becomes a refugee. And the story follows her through her own eyes, from her point of view, as she comes from Africa to Europe, and it follows her experience as a refugee. That's one voice in the book. The other voice in the book is that of Sarah, who's a woman from London, who's slightly older, who's in her early 30s. And Sarah has pretty much what you might think would be the dream life. I mean, she's successful, she's married, she has a job as a magazine editor, and she has a son, a fantastic son, who's called Charlie, but who will only answer to the name of Batman. And he's a little 4-year-old kid who really does think he's Batman and plays all the time and is fun to be around. And so one might think that Sarah had a great life. Sarah and Little Bee's lives are inextricably linked, because it turns out that the incident that Little Bee is fleeing from is an incident that involved Sarah too.
And we'll get into more details about that. I think that's a very good intro, and we don't want to give too much away, especially at this point. What I'd like to do, Chris, is to have you talk about the incident, or better put, your experience that inspired the story.
Sure. So when I was about 22 years old, I was at university, and in the UK, I don't know how it is here in the US, but we have very long summer vacations from university, and people will take paid jobs to pay the rent during that time. So I was working, doing any old jobs. I was doing casual labouring, working in the fields, working on construction sites, working in kitchens a lot. And one of the jobs I got was working in the kitchen of an immigration detention centre. Now, these are centres that we have in the UK where refugees to the country are detained. They're basically immigration prisons. I didn't know that these places existed before I, pretty much by chance, ended up working in one. So for a few days I worked in the kitchen, and I was preparing food, and I was serving it to these refugees. And these were from all of the different countries of the world, really, where refugees come from. So a lot of people from Sierra Leone, from Rwanda, from Nigeria, some from Jamaica, and some from the conflict in the Balkans that was happening at that time. I got talking with refugees, and that's never, an experience that I'd had before in my life. nor did I know that these refugee prisons existed. So it was deeply shocking to me, and it was a real eye-opener. And talking with these people, realizing how much they had been through, and how resilient and resourceful and how, likable and funny a lot of them were, it just really made me want to tell their stories, because I think it's a story that's worth being told.
Well, it certainly is. And I do know there's already a lot of talk about this book. I went to we have a local literary society, and naturally, when we sit at lunch, we talk about books. And Little Bee was one of them. And I think this is going to be a popular book for book clubs. So I think you really did capture the story.
Oh, thank you.
Let's talk about the fact that you mentioned it briefly. You tell the tale from the point of view of the two women characters, alternating chapters between the young African girl who has nothing, as you stated, but good humor, and the white British woman who has everything but happiness. It would be interesting to my listeners to know why you chose this method to tell the story.
Good question. When I'm writing a refugee story, or when one is writing a story about refugees, refugees are people who cross boundaries that aren't normally crossed in this life. So they cross boundaries of nationality and of ethnicity, and they cross, emotional, social boundaries that aren't normally crossed. And whenever you get a boundary like that, for example, the boundary between what we call the developing world and what we call the developed world, one of these boundaries that a refugee must cross, that the view from both sides of that boundary looks very different.
Yes.
And I felt that the only honest way to tell a story like this about refugees was to show the view from both sides of that fence. So Little Bee, I'm a very first-person kind of writer. I like to write in the first-person perspectives of my characters and just get really involved, almost like method acting, someone once said. Yeah.
That's a good analogy.
Yeah. I just try to become the characters, really, really concentrate.
Well, it was very successful, and it's not easy. The method that you chose can be very difficult for some writers, and you chose it very well and completed it very well. I just want to remind my audience, because a lot of people are listening as they're driving around our valley, that this is the Jacqueline Bachar Show, and I'm talking to British writer Chris Cleave about his novel, now in paperback from Simon & Schuster, Little Bee. Let's get back to the book. Chris, what kind of research did you do to create the Nigerian character of Little Bee? Because certainly you experienced these camps quite a while before you actually started working on the book. So what else did you do to create the character?
Well, researching it, I think, was one of the most interesting experiences I've ever had. I spent 2 years researching the novel, and the research for Little Bee's character came from 3 main strands, actually. The first was interviewing refugees. So I would literally sit in a room with refugees who had come from various different parts of the world, some who had been imprisoned in these refugee detention centers.
So they were now out of these centers, though, when you talked to them?
That's right.
Okay.
So I talked to people who'd been through the system.
Mm-hmm.
So I did maybe, a couple of dozen, formal research interviews, wrote them up, wrote myself notes, and tried to, think about what were the commonalities of that refugee experience. Second mainstream that I went through was a lot of book learning. So I went through, reams and reams of official transcripts of reports on these immigration detention centers, just to pick out the few details that I think really make fiction come alive. So, I read a 400-page report and just got one sentence from it that I thought was a gem.
So
example,
you used your journalistic due diligence then in doing this.
Oh yeah,
yeah, great.
I don't know. Yeah, I guess due diligence, but also just as a storyteller, you want to find these details that you just couldn't make up.
Yes,
You know what I mean? That make
absolutely.
the story ring true. For example, I found out that if you're in an immigration detention prison and you have a headache, well, you have to fill in a form in writing 24 hours in advance to say that you have
24 hours in advance. Yes, you
exactly.
you use that in the book, and I think my reaction was the same
Yeah,
to that. 24 hours, you got to know the next day you're going to have a headache.
exactly. So that you can have a Tylenol or whatever.
Amazing.
These are the sort of details that you just couldn't make up, and
Right.
they speak. They're trivial, small details, but if you put them in, then they make the whole novel ring true.
Yes, and it did. Well,
So
let
that
me.
was well. I was just going to say very
Oh,
very quickly. The
okay.
third piece of research for Little B was researching Nigerian English, which is a very
Ah,
beautiful language in its own right, and so I listened a lot to Nigerian English being spoken, and I read dictionaries of Nigerian English, and fell in love with it as a language. It has such rich vocabulary and such wonderful proverbs. Um, and for example, there's a proverb that I end the book with from Nigeria, which goes like this: If your face is swollen from the severe beatings of life, smile and pretend to be a fat man.
I loved that.
It's
I
great,
loved
isn't it?
that.
How
That
could you
that
not fall in love
yes, that
with that
tells a
language?
lot. Well, I certainly fell in love with Little B, and I know your readers, additional readers, will as well. Let me ask you now that how was it? Not only a man, but a white man could write from not only the woman's point of view, but again, the two totally different cultures. Now, obviously, you've answered part of the question by talking about the research, but I don't think every male writer can successfully capture the woman's point of view, and you did. Did you encounter? How did you do it? And did you encounter any problems in the writing from the woman point of view?
Yeah, I see. Yeah, good question. I think the way I write, I really need to be able to capture voices because I am, as I said, a very first-person writer. I'm not very good when I write in the third person. I don't really do that voice of God narrative that looks at
Mm-hmm.
people from a great height. I think I'm one of those writers that's involved. I feel like I've got skin in the game, and it's like my story too. So
Sure.
I have to get myself to the point where I can write characters that are very different from me, and I think I almost deliberately do that. I don't. As I'm a storyteller, I don't want to be writing about my own life. I want to be telling stories that I go
Mm-hmm.
out and discover.
Mm-hmm.
So I have this rule for myself as a writer, actually, which is not to write about myself. And I go out there and I try to find whatever I think is the biggest story in town, and then I try to write about it from an unusual perspective,
Mm-hmm.
and for the most adventurous readers, for the people who are ready to come along for a pretty wild ride.
But
And that
again,
involves
what helped you to capture the woman's thought process? Because to me, men think differently, and I don't mean that as a sexist comment, but as in reading the thoughts of the women and the talk of the women, one could almost say that a woman did write the story. So, how did you do
Oh, thanks very much.
it?
Well, I listen very carefully.
Okay.
As a writer, I feel that one of my jobs is to make myself very small, so that my characters can become big. I listen very hard, make sure I'm not writing about myself. So therefore, I need to listen very carefully to speech patterns and listen to that sort of inner voice that you get as a writer when you put yourself into the mind of another.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that comes through very deep concentration. I mean, there's no way I can explain it other than to say that I sit down in front of a blank page in a small room, eliminate all distractions, and try to totally simplify my life so that I really don't have anything in it that gets in the way of developing those voices. And I listen and I think very carefully, and I try to think from a perspective of someone who has a different gender or a different sexuality or a different ethnicity from my own. And through careful thought and observation, try to inhabit the mind of that character. And when I'm writing a female character, for example, because I don't think that there is one way of being a woman or one way of being a man. I mean, there men and women come in lots of different flavors, and when I'm writing as a woman, I'm not sitting down and thinking, right, what would a woman do in this situation? Because different women would do different things. So when I try to write the whole person. I try to write a person rather than a gender, and I try to think when I'm writing a character, well, I need to know 4 things about them. I need to know what was the worst day of their whole life, what was the best day of their whole life, what do they hope for, and what are they afraid of.
Well, and
if
on
I
that,
know those 4 things, then I know that person, whether they're a man or a woman or a child or an adult.
I've got a couple of questions that I think are very important. First of all, in Little B, the female characters, in my opinion, showed more strength of character and of person than the woman's husband. Now, the same held true in your first novel, Incendiary. The woman in that story gets involved with another man who was pretty much a weakling. And the details of that story we'll get into. As a writer, are you drawn to the stronger woman? And also, are you saying something about how you see society?
Time and again, when I was interviewing refugees, I was struck by how often it is that it's the woman who keeps families together. It's women that form the strongest core of families, who primarily look after children all over the world. And there is such a thing as a terrific father, and I know a lot of them. And if the father and the mother are both very strong, then that's great, and it's a wonderful family. But the person that's more consistently strong in most families that I've researched is the female character, and that's why I'm really drawn to writing about them in my novels, which always have kids in them, as the core unit of the family. Now, I'm not down on men at all, actually. It just happens that in the last 2 books that I've written, that the female characters tend to be the strong ones. Actually, the one that I'm writing at the moment, I've got a central male character for the first time.
Oh.
And who I really like too. So it's not as if I have this... I don't have an agenda one way or the other.
Yes, I didn't see it as an agenda.
Yeah.
I saw it as another strength of you as a writer, as a matter of fact. And people like to know these things about writers. They always want to know the writing process. So this is why I ask you that.
Yeah, I just find it fascinating writing these female characters because they are strong, and women do talk about things in a different way from men. They'll sit down and talk about real issues.
Absolutely.
In a way that men won't. So writing dialogue between women can be really interesting.
Well, my next question is a rather long one. And first, I'm going to make a statement. It's a long statement, but bear with me because I want to talk about some of your quotes, okay?
Right. Okay, I'm ready.
All right, and pardon me. You have said that you, quote, write to entertain, unquote, and that you, quote, might just as well write about something that moves you, unquote. Yet you also say that you are not, again, quote, trying to change the world. However, both of your books are stories that really shock. Little B relates to the hundreds, maybe even thousands, I don't know whether anyone really knows, of murders in Nigeria relating to the fight over oil, and those that try to escape it by fleeing to the UK, where they are then imprisoned. Incendiary, written at the time of the Madrid train bombings, was about a terrorist bombing in London that killed hundreds, or I think it was below 100. I'm going to correct myself there. But nevertheless, many people were killed. And that book focuses on its main character, a woman who loses her child and writes to Osama bin Laden about it. Now, both stories elicit strong emotions as a result of the story and the way you present it. And I'm going to say that your statements, to me, seem to belie a little bit what you say through your story and its characters. Do you really mean what you say, or are they a result of the terrorist bombings the night before Incendiary was to be published when you said that it made fiction non-important? Seems to me you are trying to say a little more than just writing the story. So you tell me.
Yeah, so what's my objective as a writer?
Right.
Yeah, I don't think that writers change the world. I think that readers change the world. I think the job of a writer is to go out there and find a big story, a big, important story that is emotionally moving and true on the emotional level, and also on the level of telling a real story about the real world we live in. That's the writer's job, to go out and to inform and to entertain as well, because learning about the real world, being involved and engaged with the real world, shouldn't be dry and tedious. It should be fascinating to us. We should look outwards from ourselves and from our own, quite self-referential societies, and look out and find the world fascinating and big, and enjoy that adventure of engaging with it. So when I say that I want to entertain, well, I really do. But I want to entertain on the theme of real life. So I guess I'm the opposite of reality TV. Reality TV is a format that isn't real at all. I'm saying, well, reality is what happens when we look outwards from our lives into this big, wide world where billions of people live without as much food, or without as much fresh water, or without as much security, or without as much freedom from basic diseases that we enjoy here. So I'm writing what I hope are entertaining stories about what I think are really important themes.
Okay, that's what I wanted to hear you say. These two stories have themes that are important to you, that have affected you in some way. I don't think that a writer can be purely distant from what he or she is writing about. And so I think you just said it. Otherwise, you wouldn't have written these two stories. Isn't that right?
That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
But I don't. When I say that I don't want to change the world, I don't think you can as a writer. I think you can go out and tell a story that's emotionally true in a way that people find engaging. But it's readers who will change the world. The big question for me is, okay, the information is out there. Now, what are people going to do with it?
Right.
You change the world by engaging in the political process, right? So if the book moves you, then you can write to your congressman, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or then you can get involved in local volunteering.
Mm-hmm.
Or then you can do pro bono work for refugees, for example. And it's those things, those practical actions that change the world.
Very good point.
Not some long tract by a writer.
Right. Well, thank you for answering that, because that's a very important thing for our listeners to hear. Let's talk about Sarah, the British character's statement that she made in Little B, that there is an unofficial three-way oil war. I'm assuming, of course, we know that things are going on in Algeria, so that's a correct statement. But you really chose in the novel not to say more about the oil war. Can you talk a little bit about why you chose not to give a little more background on that?
Yeah, that's right. Well, there is an oil conflict in the delta area of Nigeria. Western oil companies are drilling the oil. The people who are making the money from that oil tend to be the Nigerian federal government and the Western oil interests. And the people who are the big losers are the people who live in that region. So they're the people from whose land the oil is being drilled, but they're not making any money out of it. And indeed, their land is getting so polluted by the oil drilling that they can't farm it and they can't fish the rivers anymore. So they have no way of making a living. They're displaced from their lands. There's a lot of violence. That's the conflict. Nigeria is a very big petroleum exporting country. And we just tend not to like to think about it. We tend to not think about the cost in blood of the oil that we need to keep our societies going. So it's a very underreported conflict, even though thousands of people die in it. The reason I didn't want to talk too much about that conflict in the novel, apart from just to say that it existed, is because that's not really the main theme of my novel. I'm talking about the first-person perspective of a refugee. So I wanted it to be about her life and not about all of the death in that region. But secondly, I'd like to say, if people are interested in that conflict, then there are some amazing writings by a man called Ken Saro-Wiwa, who was an activist for one of the tribal populations there that was totally messed around and destroyed in many ways by oil exploitation, a tribe called the Ogoni. And he's written several books, actually, that document very beautifully why oil destroyed his homeland and what he wanted done about it. He was actually executed
How sad.
by the government
for
standing up against these Western oil companies, essentially. So
yeah,
that'd be
it's
great
terrible.
further reading for anyone that's interested in that conflict.
And terrible things go on that we often don't hear much about. Let's go back to Incendiary and give some details, please, Chris, of what happened to your book. First of all, I do want to say this is a Jacqueline Bachar show, and I'm talking to British writer Chris Cleave about his novel, now in paperback, Simon & Schuster, called Little Bee. But now we're going to talk about his book, Incendiary. Give some details as to what happened to the book, because you were all ready to publish the book, and then what happened before and then after the London bombings.
Oh, right. So Incendiary is an open letter to Osama bin Laden from a young mother who loses her husband and her son in an imagined terrorist attack on London. I wrote it in 2004, and the date of publication was the 7th of July 2005, which by a horrible coincidence was also the date of the real London terrorist bombings, in which over 50 people died. So I'd basically written a book about imagined London terrorist bombings that was published on the day of real ones. So what happened to it, quite simply, was that the book was mostly withdrawn from sale, like almost everywhere, and that's a decision that I agreed with, because if you're a writer who's writing in this space that I work in, which is in between where newspapers leave off and where the history books pick up, this very modern world where the events aren't cut and dried and cold yet. It's a disputed area, it's a dangerous area to write in, because sometimes real life becomes more interesting and more important.
Yes, and more horrific. And we here in the U.S. were certainly in despair about it as well. Let's talk about a little happier thing, and that is the fact that the movie rights to Little Bee have been sold to BBC Films with Nicole Kidman as star and producer. Now, how great is that? How do you hope to see the film develop, Chris?
It's absolutely wonderful. I'm absolutely delighted. I think that Nicole Kidman will be fabulous as Sarah.
Oh, yes. I pictured her through the book.
Yeah. I mean, she's an actress that I think is terrific. For example, when you look at a performance like she gave in The Hours,
yes,
I just think she will be stunning in this film, and it's obviously very important to me because as a writer, you do become very attached to your projects.
Of course,
see them made into good movies.
Of course,
so it's her in conjunction with BBC Films. So I think that they are going to do a terrific job, and I know the person who's going to be writing the screenplay, and she's very smart, really good writer, called Sean Slovo. So I've got really high hopes for the film.
Do you know yet, has there been any talk about who will play the character of Little Bee?
No, I don't know how they're going to cast Little Bee.
That's going to be an interesting and difficult, I would think, casting.
Yeah. There's been a lot of speculation that they'll cast an unknown African actress.
That's what I was thinking, that perhaps that will happen. It's been done in other movies.
Yeah, I think that would be very exciting.
Yes. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing the movie. That's for sure. It's going to be great. And I just want to say one other thing briefly, because we're going to be ending up here shortly. But I I usually make it a rule not to finish a book until after my interview so that I'm reserving some unknowns for the interview. But I had to finish your book. I had to know what happened. And I stayed up one night and said, I can't go to bed until I find out what happens to this character.
Right.
So, as I said, it's created a lot of discussion, and I know it's going to be great for the book clubs, and I just know it's going to make a great movie. Is there any? Has there been any discussion with you? I suppose they don't get into this a lot with authors, but has there been any discussion as to when the production might actually begin?
Oh, of the movie?
Yes.
No, I'm afraid I don't know. And and as a writer, I'm not very hands-on involved in the film.
Yes, normally that's the case.
Yeah, but I think they're doing it, as quickly as they can. And I'm really looking forward to it.
Yes.
What I will be doing is posting updates about that on my website.
Oh, tell us what the website is.
Well, my website is chriscleave.com. And on that, actually, I mean, if your listeners are interested, you can get a lot of background information on my novel there.
Yes, and I've gone on your website, and it's a great website. I really enjoyed reading that.
Oh, thank you.
Very quickly, do you have a title yet for the new book that you're working on now?
I'm afraid I don't. I don't title them. I'm like you, actually. You don't read
right.
Don't read the last page, if possible, till after the interview. I don't usually write the title till after I've written the last word.
Have you got a time frame in mind for when you're going to get it to your publisher?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I will literally be writing it the instant I get onto the plane at the end of this tour.
Uh-huh.
I'm 3/4 of the way through it already, and I've just put it on hold to come out and tour, which, I was very excited to do, because this tour is just working out brilliantly and I'm really enjoying it. But, the part of me that's a writer is just itching to get back to the
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, well,
so I think 2 months we'll see this project finished, and it's a big one for me. Again, I've spent a lot of time researching it, really enjoying writing it.
Well,
so
that's great.
Deliver it,
I don't know why it's got nothing to do with it, but it made me think of the movie The Ghostwriter that I saw last week. So it's very different, but that was an interesting concept too. Well, Chris, we are out of time. I want to thank you so much for being with us, and I hope you'll come back and talk to me with your next book. Will you do that?
I would love to.
Well, I would love to have you too, and do enjoy the rest of your tour. It's a good opportunity for you to see our country. Thanks for being here, Chris.
Thank you very much indeed for having me on your show. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you.